Maybe. Hi, welcome to Math for All, where we strive to make math creative, curious, and inclusive for everyone. I am Molly Vokey.
And I'm Heidi Subnani. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're so glad to have you here. Please let us know where you're watching from, and you can click like or subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. That would be great. We are really excited to be speaking with Sara Rezvi. Oh, no, I said that wrong. Rezvi. And she is going to be speaking with us about what mathematics is worthy of our Black, Indigenous, person of color students' attention, learning, agency, and time, and what that might look, sound, and feel like. And we're just so excited to be having this conversation today.
Yes. Yeah, this is super exciting. This is a conversation that really needs to be had. So I am going to read Sara's bio. Sara was born in Karachi, Pakistan, and immigrated to Chicago with her family in the 1980s. She considers herself a Chicagoan, but continues to remain perpetually cold. She must be cold now because I don't know how it is in Chicago, but it is freezing here in Massachusetts. Sara is now a doctoral student pursuing her PhD in mathematics curriculum and instruction with a concentration in gender women's studies at UIC, a program director for the Math Circles of Chicago and a math instructional coach. She is an alumnus of the University of Chicago, where she received her bachelor's in mathematics and master's in education. Before becoming an exhausted grad student, she taught secondary mathematics for 9 years in New York City, Chicago, and Mexico City. Her dream is to develop schools for women and girls in South Asia. Sara holds the words of Leonard Cohen close to her heart these days, especially in anticipation of the coming years. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So let's bring her in. Hello, welcome.
Hi there.
We're so happy that you're here with this super important topic to discuss. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here. I'm a little bit nervous, but I think we've got this.
Oh, don't be nervous. We're super laid back around here. So.
Just a conversation amongst math friends.
Right.
We love to start, if people don't know our guests or they don't know them well, with what's your math story? We always get really interesting answers here, and it's fun to see how everyone got to where they are in their mathematics journey. So
yeah.
Okay. So I guess I'll share mine. I wanted to reference a photo that I have near and dear to my heart. I wonder if I can share my screen for that. Yeah, there we go. So that's little baby Sara learning her numbers. So I come from, as you know, Molly said, I come from Pakistan, where I was originally born. And when I came here, English was not my first language. Neither was it for my dadi, my grandmother pictured here, nor for the rest of my family, really. And it was really important to learn not just numbers, but how they worked, how they functioned, especially because my dad was a cab driver here in Chicago. And he drove a cab for more or less almost 3 decades. And so a lot of it was, you know, me at the age of like 7, counting like all the dollar bills, like when he would come in and, you know, just counting all the numbers and figuring out the mathematics of it and understanding, okay, so he made this much today, how much is he going to make tomorrow? So a lot of it had to do with, you know, the financial literacy piece for us as, you know, first generation immigrants here in the city. I think that both my parents really instilled this like love of learning, and it came with everything, right? Like my mom's family comes from a line of like inventors and doctors and scholars, and my dad's family comes from Bihar, India originally, and they're, you know, farmers and aristocrats and all sorts of different kinds of people. But collectively, you know, there's a huge kind of intellectual background in both sides of my family. And that was translated here. And so I think numbers and math, with just the way that we had to function and exist in Chicago and learn how to exist here and live, were definitely a part of it. I remember, in the back of my dad's like Chevy station wagon, like us counting in Urdu and then translating into English in multiplication, like, do egg do tin char, like all that stuff. Like it was great. And I just remember like being scared of it and loving it simultaneously. And I've been trying to figure out the in-between space of what that means for me now, so many years later.
Interesting. Well, first of all, that picture is adorable. But the thing that just struck me is what you just said about being scared of it and did you say interested by it at the same time?
Yeah.
I feel like most people don't put those two things together. If they're scared, it's super, let's get away from it.
Well, and I wonder, like, that idea of being intrigued by something or being excited by something, and that same emotion of fear that we sometimes have, it can be, they can feel the same, and how we react to them as people. And so I think that it's such an interesting way of kind of looking at that, because math anxiety is definitely a thing. People are definitely afraid of math sometimes, but having both the curiosity to understand and to work within the field is really interesting.
Yeah. I'm also feeling like your first memory sort of is counting money, right? So that's such a useful, obviously so much math is related to money, and it's such a useful thing. And then when you get to school, often math is the thing that you do at school that you don't do anywhere else. Or at least it looks like math that you don't do anywhere else. So it's interesting that that's your first relationship with math. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, let's get into our question. This is covering up your face. I'm not going to keep it up too long. Okay. So what mathematics is worthy of BIPOC students' attention, learning, agency, and time? And what might that look like, sound like, and feel like?
And, I want to preface this by saying, like, I'm not here to claim any sort of particular expertise or knowledge, but I am here to have a conversation, right? One of the pieces that we published last year, myself and Tyrone Martinez Black, on NCTM, was all we have are questions. So one of the questions that I'm asking myself and interrogating deeply is, what does it mean to teach mathematics that is worthy of the brilliance of children of color, and particularly Black and Brown students, especially in the city of Chicago, where we live in a particularly egregiously racially segregated city, right? That it has a long history of segregation and redlining and racism here. And so what does that look and sound and feel like when it feels even more polarized these days? And if we're choosing to ignore that particular aspect in our day-to-day experiences, we're erasing people. We're erasing what students bring into their classrooms every single day by adopting a neutral or I don't see it approach, right? That's not useful. That's not productive, and that's not sustainable. But I think more oftentimes than not, there's this pendulum thing that happens in education, and you all have been in education for so long that maybe you've seen it too, like, or maybe I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it, but oh my goodness, this isn't working, so now we're going to pendulum shift the other way. That's not working. Oh my goodness, let's switch back. And it's this constant never-ending pendulum shift back and forth, and there's never anything about consistency or sustainability. And I feel like, especially in the current realities of the global pandemic, of ongoing racial violence towards all sorts of people here in this country, that we can't keep pretending that this pendulum is going to keep working, because it clearly hasn't. So that's what I wanted to preface by saying, that I'm not here to give a particular answer, but I want to have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everything you said is so true. The pendulum is, I mean, you could pick any piece of education and describe what that pendulum looks like for that particular piece of education.
Mm-hmm.
Just math, just social studies, just, any of the subject areas. And certainly racism. Yikes.
Yeah, and how people see like education as well, right? So like how valued it is, how valued the educator is. We have in the very short, it didn't take long for educators to be like this, these guiding angels or whatever who took your kids, and now that my kid is home with me at the beginning of the pandemic, they should be paid more and they should get whatever they need for the classroom. And it was not very long before that swung right back to the other side of things, where that was not the case. And
Right.
trying to keep yourself or your family healthy was seen as, not living up to the expectation as educators. And I think anytime, I mean, that's, like one small example. And I think pandemic in many ways has, like you said, like those cracks, like the cracks were there. Like
Mhm.
there have always been issues with education, with how we treat people of color, how we have kind of systemically built the United States like for a certain group of people, in with the intention of leaving out other people. Like
Right.
that's been kind of the way that things have been designed. And so anytime it feels like there is a break in that, or like the ability to kind of move forward, the backlash to that swings in so quickly that it kind of almost pushes us backwards versus letting things move forward. And because of that, we end up in this place. It feels like it's Groundhog Day. We feel again and again and again, regardless of how much we think we move forward.
Right. And so, going back to this concept of like, what is education for? Who is it for? And I think that's a conversation that we've been having for a very long time, as long as public education has existed, which hasn't been very long.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's a scholar by the name of Michael Apple who calls what we have as a society and education like the slogan system, right? Like we have no child left behind. What does that mean? Race to the top. What does that mean? Mathematics for all. What does that mean? Right? Like all of these slogans that we have, that we can reproduce very easily, but we don't necessarily have specific and distinct definitions for, about what that looks and sounds and feels like for different people who are
Mm-hmm.
being put into these public education systems that have frankly done harm and continue to do harm, right? I was volunteering at a puppet festival recently in Chicago, because why not?
A puppet festival, that sounds fun.
It was amazing. And the one that we saw a few days ago was at the American Indian Center here in Chicago, and it was my first time in that center. But the way that they opened up the show, the conversation was, these are how many children have been found at residential school sites in this country, right? And we had a moment of silence for that. We had to have that moment to acknowledge the deep atrocities that have been committed. And that's not to say that things have gotten better. I don't know. I can't argue that. But what I can say is, if we choose to ignore the real horrors of this nation, to protect whiteness and to protect white feelings and to protect white fragility and to protect certain kids from not knowing actual truth, we are not only doing a disservice to and harm to students of color, but we're also doing harm to those white students as well. And I think a lot of, when I mentioned earlier about the polarization, right? Like there's the book banning that's happening now. There's the CRT moral panic. And as somebody who's been, working on my doctoral stuff for 6-7 years now, and it's related to critical race theory and it's related to critical race feminism, I'm just kind of sitting here like, okay, I'm just going to quietly keep studying because you all don't know what you're doing. I'm just going to keep my head down because every time I ask somebody, so you're anti-CRT, what do you think it is? Like, can you explain to me what you think it is? Oh, you don't know? Okay, cool. So, that's all part of it.
This is what you think it is. That is not what it is. That's, my conversation many times as well. And I think I think this is a uniquely American thing, and I could be wrong, but I think we often feel like if we make space for others, that we are losing something ourselves. So like if we make space for voices from other ethnic groups or backgrounds or genders, that we then lose something. Right. And that's that's just not true. It's not true. You gain so much when you are able to hear. The collective whole gains when other voices are heard. Your understanding, my way of seeing and viewing changes and improves when I have interactions with people who don't have the same background or language or religion or whatever it happens to be. We all grow in those experiences.
Yeah, but Heidi, you have to care.
Yeah, that's true.
You have to care for that to be true.
Mm-hmm. And you have to care and push beyond like your own initial awkwardness or discomfort, right? And I'm just saying you as a collective.
No, for sure.
Like, if we think about, somebody check me on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, that the root word of education in Latin, I think it's educe, I don't know how to say it, but it means to pull out or to take out, right? To make clear. And if that's the case, then that's not if education, the purpose of it is to excavate and pull out and make things illuminated and make things clear, that's not always a comfortable process.
No.
But it's a necessary one, right? And we do ourselves a disservice if we ask mathematics in particular to be neutral, or, hey, 2 + 2 is 4 and it's always going to be 4 and therefore it's the truth and that's it. We can't argue about it. We can't talk about it. It is what it is. And I'm not referencing any Twitter beef from years ago because I could barely understand that. But what I am referencing or thinking about, right, is math is also socially constructed. It's also a human invention. There's also conversations to be happening about who has been positioned as a math person and who hasn't throughout our time, and how that definition has been amorphous and fluid and dynamic and changing and stochastic, right? In some instances, it's acceptable to be good at math. In some instances, it's not. I mean, I'm just thinking about my own experience, right? Like, as a South Asian woman, on some level, I was expected to be really, really good at it. And on other instances, I was told that, okay, fine, this is as far as you can go. And now it's time for you to get married. And now it's time for you to start a family. You're the eldest daughter. You've got to so even with that, there are certain parameters and boundaries constantly put in place based on who you are and how you embody yourself. That needs to be talked about.
For sure. For sure. So much to talk about. My goodness. Wow.
So what should we, when we're thinking about having this conversation with what kind of math is worthy, how do we
start? Yeah. How do we start?
So when I was quickly putting some of these slides together, I'm going to admit it live a couple of hours ago. Sorry, everybody. When I was putting this conversation in my head together a few hours ago, one of the questions that came up, like, as somebody who was training to be a mathematician at one point in my life, okay, best way to think about worthiness, or whatever, however we're defining that, is to maybe define also unworthiness, right? We also learn from counter examples, as we learn from examples. So what is unworthy, right? What is unsustainable? What is not useful? What is unproductive? And I'm curious to hear what you all think about that. What are some things that are not useful or relevant or worthy at this moment in time for particularly students of color, and in particular thinking about Black History Month, for Black students, for Indigenous students, for Latinx students, all of our students? Like, what is unworthy, and how do we know?
I feel like that's such a hard question. Like if I were to sit down and look at like, take seventh grade and prioritize, and honestly, not to sound racist or anything, but like just with a student in mind, not necessarily a black student or white student or anyone. But if I were to sit down and pick apart, I definitely could do that. But like overall, thinking about this so big, I mean, I feel like I would cut out half of high school. I mean, I don't know. All the high school teachers are going to be mad at me for saying that, but I don't know. I think this question is so interesting on so many levels. Heidi, do you have a place where you would start?
This was the conversation I've been having the last, not specifically in this way, but so telling time on an analog clock.
Okay.
Regardless of student, really, but like in particular, I was in a space where, I mean, we have I think we need to address the disproportionate number of students of color in special education programs and what gets written into IEPs. Let's start there. And that things like telling time on an analog clock get written into students' plans, and then they become a barrier to other kinds of mathematics learning. So I'm looking at it in that, like, so actually, like, every phone is primarily digital. Do I want students to have an understanding of the concept of time and how much time has passed? That's important because, like, when we're working in any job, doing anything, having an understanding of how long it takes to do something. Like if you're an entrepreneur, you need to be able to, okay, this job is going to take me this amount of time. This is what I should be asking to pay versus like that example versus, well, if I'm flipping things at McDonald's, that's the other end of it, right? Like that people do one of these extremes or the other. I'm not so sure any child should be put through the long division.
Okay. Yes, absolutely.
Like
we need to cut out long division forever. No one ever is going to use it past sixth grade.
Yeah.
When do you have to use it? Everybody has a calculator. Right. Everybody has a computer. Everybody has a phone.
So estimation in that point, absolutely. Is your answer going to be reasonable? Right. So can I have that conversation with students? But I feel like those type of procedural things. So using the American standard algorithm for multi-digit multiplication, which we think it's the only one, but like it's just one of many. Like that idea, we teach these procedures and they become gatekeepers to the type of mathematics that I would say is worthy for students.
Right.
But I think like students global, but I think we use those things to block access in particular to students who learn differently or who are students of color.
It also
or whatever, like they become barriers. So I'm not so sure what makes those other things more worthy, like the math that we're trying to get to, but I do see the block.
but you're right, Heidi, because even thinking about like learning any of those standard algorithms that you were just talking about, having that be the gatekeeper, even to just in that particular thing, the gatekeeper to problem solving. So like unless you get this, we're not going to do any of problem solving using this thing, right? And the problem solving is the whole point of it. Like if you are ever going to use division in your life, you need to know why you're doing the division and how it applies to anybody's life. So if you can't do the algorithm, then you can't do the problem solving. I disagree.
And I think you both are, I mean, thank you for that. I think you both are in parallel to the way I was thinking about this too. And I actually wanted to reference a slide here.
Good.
In some of my doctoral work, right, I'm thinking about Django Paris's, culturally sustaining pedagogy, and how we think about worthiness or unworthiness of mathematics, but what we actually think about is worthiness and unworthiness of students.
Mhm.
And so much of our current landscape is still very much deficit based.
Mhm.
Think about those deficit perspectives through an intersectional lens, because race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, all that stuff is always operating, whether on the conscious level or on the subconscious level. It is there. It is present within our systems, right? That's why we call it systemic. So the fact that even to this day, as you were saying, it becomes a gatekeeper, is real and true, and still very much present in many of the places that I've coached, that I've personally taught at, that I'm sure you all have experienced yourself, right? So how do we, one of the things that I was thinking about, right, is instead of the deficit approach, what is the resource or asset-based approach, um, to consider when we think about each student as agentic, as powerful, as students who bring knowledge and lived experiences and beautiful ideas and brilliance into the classroom, rather than what Paulo Freire calls the banking model, right? Where it's, I pour in fractions into your skull and now you know fractions. I pour in the long division algorithm and now you supposedly know the long division algorithm. But do you actually know how to use it? Do you know how it's connected to later on to matrices when you get to pre-calc? Do you understand how it connects to all these other aspects where long division was taught to you in 4th grade, but do you understand how that same kind of thing might relate to polynomial division when you get to calculus, right?
Mhm.
All of those things are inherently interconnected, but if we're only teaching from a deficit student-centered based approach, and in particular student deficit-based approach that relies on banking kind of metaphors to teach mathematics, that's problematic. That's really deeply problematic. And that's troubling that so many of the standards, like we have so many standards, right? When I was a teacher, it's like, oh my God, I have how much to cover? Oh my
Mm.
God. I mean, I never got to the data chapter. I never got to the statistic chapter, no matter what grade I was teaching. And it was awful because that's one of the most fun things to explore with kids, right? If I
Mhm.
give you a bunch of Skittles, sort them into reds, greens, whatever colors, right? And then let's talk about it from a histogram. Let's talk about it from a box and whisker plot. Let's talk about it and actually analyze what's happening. But it was so rare to get to the actual physical aspects of,
Mhm.
because we were so heavily trying to cover the skills. The
Mhm.
skills were atomized, right? And that's hard because math isn't discrete. Math is a conversation, it's a language. So how do we speak it so that we're not just teaching kids verbs and gerunds, but we're actually teaching them how to speak it. It's
Mhm.
alive.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is teachers don't know. They don't know how to speak it, and I'm hoping that our pre-service teachers are learning more about mathematics as a language, so to speak, and that it's much more about problem solving and how do we relate these two things instead of these skills in isolation, and everything you just said. I hope that I'm learning myself. My daughter is a freshman in college hoping to be a teacher, and so I'm kind of following her learning trend, but she's only had one semester, so we're not too far.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that she's in that pipeline. We need people who are aware and who know that this can't be the end, right? There's a fear that I have right now of what's happening in our country with public education, with what's already happened in certain parts of the country where its public education has been defunded, where it's been politicized so much that people are afraid to reference or say anything beyond what's in the curriculum, and the curriculum itself is so highly regulated, right? um, where does the teaching happen when it's so constrained, and how do we go beyond that when our kids are bringing their entire beings into that space? um, when I taught in New York, so many of my students would come in, like some of them were excited to be there, some of them were upset, some of them were hangry, they're like, some of them had a bad night with mom or dad or whomever, right? There was all sorts of things that they were bringing in. Kids are kids, they're going to bring in who they are. And even if you're supposedly been hired to teach mathematics, that's not your job. Your job is to teach mathematics to students. It's not your job to teach mathematics. It's your job to teach mathematics to students. And those are not the same thing. And I feel like we have forgotten to some degree that.
Yeah, I definitely, I think that you're absolutely right, because I definitely know when I first started teaching that it was just, well, I taught that. It wasn't, they learned it,
Right.
but it didn't matter because I taught it. So it's fine.
Yeah.
I did my job. It's not my fault. They didn't, we need to come further than that. We need to figure that out for sure.
And I think that, like, one of the things that's so beautiful about working with like little kids is that they're so excited about everything, right? You know, you walk in and you're wearing jeans and they're like, Miss Rezvi, you never wear jeans. Is it a special day? Like, no, I just don't have laundry. That's why I wear jeans, you know? And they're excited about it. They're, you know, I'm talking about like kindergartners and second graders, and they're just so happy to see you. And then you teach middle school and they're still pretty happy, and they're still like, but they're in their feelings a little bit. And then you teach high school, and it's like pulling teeth sometimes, right? Like, you know, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like Bueller, no one's answering. Like, that's what it feels like sometimes. So part of like my own learning in teaching math over all these years has been, how do I center joy? How do I center excitement? Why would a 14-year-old care about trigonometry? Why would a 17-year-old care about Pascal's triangle? What is so special about the binomial theorem? Like, who cares? What does it matter, right? And the answer is because learning itself is beautiful and exciting. But if we, as you were saying, Heidi, if we put all these gatekeepers in the way, if we put all these barriers in the way, we never get to the cool stuff. We're just painting. We're just learning how to paint. We don't actually see the full picture. We're just learning how to like hold the water brush or whatever and do the same thing over and over again. And that's math, right? That's sad.
It is sad. We had a really cool conversation, not last week, 2 weeks ago, and it was the opposite of this painting with the, just learning the paintbrush. I mean, it was fascinating to see the kinds of math that it's happening in some classrooms, and I wish that was happening in all classrooms. Like, it was what you just said reminded me that there is some good stuff going on, but it's not universal.
And
who has access? You know, like even in, okay, that's a public school. Like, where else is it happening? Are we making it systemic and available for all students?
We need to clone Lebo and have him go to all the schools.
Right. Yeah. And we know the answer. I mean, like, Marion, I saw one of her quotes running around on Twitter the other day, and I was like, oh, Marion, you're so wonderful. And I think the quote was like, do you choose to be a key maker or a gatekeeper, right? And it made me think about, Dr. Bob Moses's work with radical equations and the Civil Rights Project with the Algebra Project, right? And how that for him was his life's work about algebra being a gatekeeper for Black students, just like calculus is for so many students in high school, and how that's a contrived invention that we educators, that we policymakers, that we adults have constructed and created, and that also reproduces harm, right? So how do we disrupt it? How do we change it? How do we
have to have the conversation, right? Because so many people, I mean, here I am, a white woman, having always wanted to be a teacher, and I didn't know. I didn't know all of these things, and I didn't know the history of schools, and how I didn't realize. And I'm actually thinking back. There's a comment. Somebody, Brandy, was saying, I think it's important that we be explicit. Maybe I'll put it up there. This was back from our conversation earlier, but I didn't know this. I didn't know that schools were created for white males. And when I learned this, and I, as an adult and well into my teaching career, I started to like notice things. But because the conversation, I never had that conversation. I never heard that conversation, not ever. So these conversations, as you said in the beginning of this, that you're just here to have to start the conversation, but I didn't know any of that. And now I do. So now I have this show, so I can hope to help have these conversations, right? I mean, there needs to be a platform for that.
And I would argue exactly, right? The history of this country is built on settler colonialism, on genocide, on enslavement. You know, one of the things that I appreciate about my doctoral work and studying race is a piece by Ian Haney Lopez about the fact that race is plastic. And I love that metaphor because it shifts, it changes. It's you know, when we say race is a social construct, that just sounds like buzzwords at this point, right? But what does it actually mean? Well, 100 years ago, here's how Mexican Americans were defined. Here's how they were defined now by the census. Here's how they're defined in 2022. You know, 70 years ago, the Irish were not considered part of the white race, right? And that's also part of it too. So the fact that this is, again, a shifting, changing thing, it makes it so hard to discuss because it keeps moving. The goalpost keeps shifting, but yet the wealth and the power and the privilege remains in the hands of the few. And as we've seen in the pandemic, that's exacerbated. That's become even more so rather than less, right? So there's a real concern about how all of these kind of structural forces are coming down into the very zoomed in lens of a typical 7th grade classroom in the middle of, you know, Main Street, nowhere, Illinois, right? Or in United States, wherever, right? So like, what is happening there? So I mean, I know we don't have too much time left, so I wanted to shift a little bit.
Go ahead.
To just some of the things that I've been trying to think about in my work, and how centering joy, centering agency, centering student culture, centering and respecting student voice, it's good. It's just good teaching, but it's also particularly, I think, useful in my work with students of color in particular. So just some kind of things that I think about a lot is how we are interdisciplinary. One of the pieces that we've written from a few years ago is this article on where is it? I think on Zoom, I'm not sure, but it's about interrogating how we can make these connections between math and literacy in English class, right? There's all these like things about math and science and math and engineering, STEM, whatever. But hey, what if I talk to the teacher down the hall who's teaching a really great YA novel, and let's look and interrogate that, and let's look and see how they're talking about math in those in that novel, and let's see if it maps to students' experiences in my math class, and maybe we can do some sort of interdisciplinary unit where kids are reflecting on their own evolving mathematical identity, right? Because identity is something that's constructed over time. It's not like we all like woke up one day and like, you know what, I'm going to have a show on YouTube about math. Like that's what you decided. So how did you decide that? It's something that's important to you, right? But that wasn't true. Maybe, I don't know how long the show's been around, but maybe it wasn't true necessarily 10, 15
wasn't true 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not there.
Right.
Yeah.
So our identities, even as adults, as learners, as people who are wanting to constantly be more curious about the world, that evolves. So why not center that identity reality for students in math classes as well? So literacy is one way that I think about it. Another way I think about it is my work with Math Circles of Chicago. I'm the program director there, and I work very closely with the executive director, Doug O'Rourke, who founded the organization a few years ago. And we do a lot of stuff where it's not, going back to the gatekeeper thing of it's so easy to say, okay, well, these are the prerequisites to be part of this program, right? There's so many programs out there that say you must have this background in order to even be considered. Oh, and by the way, it's a $250 registration fee, right? So who do you think that's going to attract? Who do you think has the a privilege and ability and whatever to get into all of that? I'm not necessarily saying always, right? But there are questions that come up. So in our program, one of the things that we do is our math circles are totally free. We have one of the largest math circles, I think, in the country. Totally free. And we're donation based, and we ask people to donate based on their income level as a kind of structured regimen. And the other thing that we do is we don't really think about prerequisites. We say, hey, this is a really good fit for middle school students. And here's why. We're making all of our problems and activities low floor, high ceiling, so that anyone who has some curiosity about it can find some way into the math, right? So that might mean, Pascal's triangle and exploring that. That might mean this really cool mad vet problem where if I put in 2 dogs and 1 cat into this machine, it spits out a sheep. If I put in 4 dogs and 2 cats, it spits out 3 sheep. What's the function or what's the rule, right? And it's not asking you to do algebra, but it secretly is. And we don't have to use those words, right? We can just think about it in a fun way. So that's one other thing that I really think about with the planning and preparation and things like that. I wanted to ask you all, what do you think the left picture is here doing mathematically?
It reminds me of the Mobile puzzles.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, how do we teach systems of equations? How do we teach algebra in a creative way? Maybe they can pick it up. Maybe they can weigh it. Maybe they can this is really annoying. I wonder how much each red one is, right? And actually go and figure it out without me saying a whole lot. I'm thinking about Dan Meyer's work of taking all the fluff out of the textbooks because so much of it is so scaffolded.
Deleting the text.
Yeah.
Yes, that's one of my favorites.
It's such a beautiful concept, right? Because what do mathematicians do? Do they have a pre-made, pathway that they're very stringently walking? No, of course not. They're exploring. So how do we cultivate that? How do we cultivate curiosity and exploration? And that might mean something as simple as, oops, sorry, I went too fast. That might mean something as simple as a whiteboard, right? And hey, I want you to just one of the classes that I coached a couple of years ago was the teacher had these kind of white butcher paper all around the classroom, and it was decentralized so that he did very little whole group teaching, and it was very much student centered. Okay, here's the problem, go explore, talk it out, and then when we're ready to debrief, we're all going to gather around the student, and they're going to explain their thinking, and they're going to explain their knowledge and expertise, and other folks are going to come in and support them, so that the knowledge is being co-constructed rather than positioning the teacher as the expert who's shoving knowledge into the brain. And I thought that was really powerful.
I love that. We need more videos of that type of teaching, so that when we go into schools and talk about this very thing, that we have something to show teachers, because it's so powerful.
It is. And we learn by doing, right? It's one thing to read these textbooks and get debriefed or coached on your own teaching, but it's another thing to see it in action and then think about not mimicking it, but thinking about how you yourself as a teacher can adopt it from your own perspective, right? So much of my coaching conversations are I don't want you to teach like me. I want you to teach like you. I want you to teach like how you want to teach, in a way that is supportive and productive for your students. So what does that look like for you? Because that might not look the same as it does for me, right? These are just examples, but it's not the same.
Right.
Again, because we all bring in our own lived experiences, and that also matters, right? One of the last things that we did a few years ago in one of the math circle summer camps is we did a graph theory summer camp, and all of my students here are showing off their straw polyhedra that we were using to construct different things, and it was beautiful. You know how the whole the rectangles of doom via Zoom pandemic teaching where nobody has their camera on.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so why don't you have your camera on? Because there's no reason to have it on. But if you want to show off your awesome polyhedra, then you have a mathematical reason to explain your thinking and to have a reason to turn it on. Otherwise, why would you? Right. So
cool.
And the last thing I just want to show is more of the graph theory camp. This is a student who was really excited about learning about Brazil, but she was applying the four color theorem here and trying to explain why it works for the map of not just Brazil but South America. And she was just really excited about learning about both the continent and also applying the mathematics to the continent. She did it, and she did an excellent job explaining it. So, like,
awesome.
Again, I don't have all the answers, but I know that math is embodied. Here we're dancing a math activity using angles. We know that math is learned best by explaining and doing and thinking and creating. So maybe that's one answer. I don't claim that's the only answer to the question that I asked at the beginning of this, but maybe that's one way of thinking about it. And I know we're all exhausted.
Start anyways, right? It's a place to start.
Mm-hmm. And I think if students are more engaged, it is easier to teach. And I don't say, like, it's more energizing, I guess, in those situations. If we really think about and students are interacting more, then it makes it easier for us as the educators in those spaces as well. In addition to the math circles, how else can people learn more about your work?
Well, I have a website, sararezvi.com. It has some of my publications and writing on it. It also has some of my poetry on it, so please don't judge me. I think it's good, but I also think it's not good, so forgive me.
No such thing. There's no such thing.
Oh, you're so human.
I never grew out of the awkward math person, so I'm still the same person that I was.
I love it. I love it.
But that's where you can find some of my information. I'm pretty active on Twitter as well, so if you wanted to connect that way.
Well, Brandy's saying that your poetry is good, so so somebody's here to argue on your behalf.
Well, thank you, Brandy. I appreciate it.
And then they can find you here because this is where you work.
Yep.
One of my jobs. I have many jobs, but that's one of them.
Of course. And they can reach you here publicly, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today. But most of all, thank you for starting this conversation and for making it easy to talk about for this white girl, and just doing the work that you're doing for real. It needs to be done.
Thank you. I'm doing my best. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. And for everybody watching out there, thank you for being present.
Yeah. All right. Well, obviously we could do that all day.
Yeah. Yes.
All day.
I'm loving that idea. I'm thinking about math camp that I'm, planning with the district. And I'm like, okay, I'm only going to go back and relook at a couple of things that I've been thinking about.
All right. Make it more fun. So in 2 weeks, we're going to talk to Christina Tonevald. She actually has a summit coming up, which she normally does in the summer. And that is coming up in February. So I'm sure she will be mentioning that. That will be on February 16th.
Excellent. So we thank you all for joining us this evening. If you wouldn't mind letting us know where you're watching from, you can follow us on YouTube or on Facebook to find out more about other upcoming guests that we have and look at previous conversations that we have had before.
And Twitter too.
Oh, and Twitter also. Yes, that is true. So thank you for joining us, and that we hope that you will keep math creative, curious, and inclusive for all. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.